We did a fairly exhaustive tour of the state. Unfortunately, we never got to South Jersey because that was scheduled for October 30th, Tuesday, October 30th. And as we all know, that was the day after the hurricane. And so we're actually almost looking at two New Jerseys now, the pre-Sandy New Jersey and the post-Sandy New Jersey. Now, when we titled this seminar Road to Recovery some months ago, we of course had no idea of the true impact of that title. So the first panel that we're going to do today, the economy, the discussion, I'm thrilled to have people with me on the panel. We've got one more panelist who's stuck in traffic, Brian Shactman. He'll be joining us hopefully momentarily. And I'll ask Dr. Posner, if you'd like to start, just introduce yourself briefly and we'll all of us introduced.
Sure, thank you, Becky, for inviting me. My name is Izzy Posner. I'm from that southern part of the state. I work at Stockton College. Some of you may know Stockton, Atlantic City. I run an institute called the Levenson Institute of Gaming, Hospitality, and Tourism at the college.
Chief Hughes, Bloustein School at Rutgers, in the School of Public Policy. Charles Steindel, I'm Chief Economist at the State Treasury Department. My unit is responsible for the revenue forecast for the state, and of course, having forecasted revenues means we have to have some idea of the economy as a whole.
Kevin McCabe, I'm the president of the New Jersey Carpenter Contractor Trust, which is a labor management cooperative of union contractors and carpenters.
Really? And we'll give Brian Shactman.
I'm sorry.
CNBC, perfect timing.
Need a microphone?
We do. We'll get you mic'd up here. We'll move on. Let you give it a chance to get mic'd up. Okay, we're dealing with some audio issues, but I think we're in good shape. Let's focus, if we can, almost on the pre-Sandy economy and the post-Sandy economy. And if we start with where we were before the hurricane, things were not looking that good in New Jersey. And Dr. Hughes and Dr. Steindel, let's let you maybe just recap briefly what we were looking at, say, in mid-October in terms of unemployment. We're running ahead of the national average. Revenue projections, actual revenue is down from projections. State sales tax revenue was down even in October. How were we looking then in terms of outlook? I guess, was it as grim as it looked? Dr. Steindel?
I guess I can start. Let's talk about the basic economy. Of course, we did lose a fair number of jobs in October, and that was, the numbers are collected before Sandy hit the state. On the other hand, those monthly numbers do move around a bit. The state, weather seems to be the big story around the state the last year. We had the incredibly mild winter last year, and I think that brought some activity forward into the winter and spring. And I think there was some leveling off in the summer and early fall as more or less a natural reaction. It's true, however, the unemployment rate remained extremely high. We're glad to see it actually began to tick down a little bit in both September and October, but still 9.7% is too high. On the revenue side, yes, overall revenues were less than we're projecting, although to tell you the truth, you have to look at the different aspects of our revenue base. The income tax, where there was a lot of controversy about our projections, our 8% projections for the fiscal year being much too high, actually was coming in a little above our estimates, which was pretty impressive.
Yes,
pretty impressive, which suggests that income for the state, for state residents, is actually pretty well maintained, even though employment has been a bit of a disappointment. The sales tax is a puzzle. Frankly, we are a little surprised that the sales tax has been so lackluster. I mean, everybody's kind of surprised at that. We don't quite have the specific answer to that. We were basically figuring some of our demand was just being lagged and we would see it come back later in the year. So it was really a tale of two taxes here. It wasn't overall revenue that was disappointing. It was sales versus income. It was income versus sales tax. Income is the largest revenue source, although sales is number 2 and a very important source. Exactly. We're not going to downgrade that.
Yeah. So Dr. Hughes, would you have a theory as to why we're down by the sales tax collection? I think we're the third, was the third biggest drop in the country.
No, not really. But I think we have to look at a bigger 3-state area. And I think for the first time, before Sandy, actually the 3 governors, Governor of New York, Governor of Connecticut, and Governor of New Jersey, all aligned together and were complaining about the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
So it's not the facts are wrong, the numbers are wrong.
There are some real problems with the two. with the two surveys. We have a payroll employment survey, which is employers, and we have an unemployment rate, which is a household survey. And in all three states, there was a disconnect where payroll employment was growing, which should suggest that the unemployment rate was going down, but the unemployment rate was going up in all three states. And then even in the New Jersey had a disappointing payroll number in October, and so did New York and New York City. And their economy has been doing a lot better than ours. They have a much stronger tourism base. They got a lot of federal aid after the collapse of the credit markets and the like. So the numbers aren't aligning like they normally should. Sales tax revenue, maybe it could be a much greater penetration of internet shopping, so they're not going to bricks and mortar stores. They're not paying the sales tax.
Well, we thought we've accounted for that, but you know.
Okay, there's a couple of directions we want to go in, but Brian, let's get your take. You look at the economy from a national perspective. When you look at New Jersey relative to the rest of the country, what's your take on how we're doing here?
Well, it's funny because and we talked about this a lot with Governor Christie pre-storm. It's shocking to a lot of people that the unemployment rate in New Jersey is above the national average. That is something that when you think of New Jersey, you do not. When you clump it with Connecticut and New York, you don't think of it like that. The one thing I just wanted to circle back, nationally we talk a lot about the participation rates, and a lot of the problem with the national numbers, when the BLS number is different than the employment number, they talk about maybe an influx and the people looking for work again. Is that the possible way that the numbers have been off between the BLS and the jobs?
Well, it's sort of gyrated. I mean, you could tell different stories month to month, but when the problem was particularly intense, which was in the late spring and the early summer, when there was this massive disconnect, actually our labor force wasn't growing all that rapidly. The labor force, it was the employment side of the picture. They were saying there are more jobs in New Jersey, but a lot fewer people working.
Right.
That didn't make a whole lot of sense.
Well, I just want to interject on 2 points. One is that we talk about structural unemployment, whether it's true or not, and we talk to so many employers who say, we have these jobs, we don't have the people, we don't have the people to apply for these jobs, and I think that the analogy made is if you lost your job as an auto mechanic technician, you might not ever get that job as an auto mechanic technician again, but you could get an IT job, but then you have to go back and get your education taken care of. And the other thing I want to talk about New Jersey that I find fascinating with Sandy is what do you do with Atlantic City? Because I've done a lot of work with casinos, right? And I've been to Pennsylvania, I've been to Ohio, and these states that are just opening up casinos every other month. And we talk a lot about, well, what is that taking away from Connecticut? What is that taking away from New Jersey and Atlantic City? And I don't know if that has an impact on the sales tax receipts, but I do know that there's been a bit of a tectonic shift because of the open arms to gaming in other parts of the country.
Do we figure casino revenue in sales tax?
No,
that's really
there's
a part of it,
there's
right?
a separate tax on casinos.
And our casino expert, Dr. Posner?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Giving the South Jersey perspective, I just want to key off something you said earlier about New Jersey perplexing that it would be a high unemployment state. But I think if you really look at it, drill down a little bit, you're really looking at several counties in the north and then really Cumberland and Atlantic in the south. And I think they're very different stories. In the north, you look at Hudson, Essex, and Passaic, where you have about 11, 12, not about 12, but probably about 11% unemployment in those regions. And I think there it's a very, very different story than Cumberland and Atlantic. And I think you probably want to comment on that more than I would. But I've got my own theories about. So it's not really New Jersey.
Right.
It's really
five
drill
spots.
down
Right.
to look into.
That's right.
I think a deeper dive. I think you get some good insight.
So you're saying those counties ultimately bring the entire state average?
Well, the northeast part, of course, is the population is there. The northeast is a little bit of a puzzle because fundamentally that's the New York labor market.
Yeah.
It is a little puzzle why the unemployment rate is so high in those counties. South Jersey, I'm afraid, it is a question of jobs and opportunities.
Between Cumberland and Atlantic, it is a very different story. But I think in the northern part of the state, I think what you're seeing is probably a skills gap between the skills that are available in the labor force and the pretty sophisticated jobs that are still there in terms of biotech, technology.
Well, Kevin, you're the
so
Carpenters.
I think there's a really big disconnect. I do want to get back to the casino question.
But we're going to hold
I'll
that
get
for a minute.
back, whatever you
You're
want.
the Carpenters contractors, which is obviously highly skilled labor, but what are you finding in terms of your members? Are they spread out geographically, and what's, pre-Sandy, what was the outlook?
Pre-Sandy, we had seen over the last year or so, we had seen our unemployment rate, within our membership that is, go down. You know, at the high point, it was, say, 09. We were approaching 50% unemployment within the Carpenters. Excuse me. We had not seen numbers like that, and it's interesting because we had a number of our leaders within the Carpenters who were around in the mid to late 70s when they, after the crash of 08 and in the early part of 09, were saying, we've been there, telling some of the younger members, don't fret, we've been there. We've seen the worst, we saw the 70s. A lot of those leaders are no longer with us because they saw that this was going to be a long haul. Within the last year and a half, we had seen our numbers come down. Part of that was we are pocket driven, like you had just alluded to. And part of the reason why our number had come down considerably was the Rebel. The Rebel helped. It was such an enormous job.
That was the construction project that
So
essentially
it
went
was
from
that
win to
big that it
win.
moved the needle?
Yes, it did.
Wow. 2.4 billion.
No, I mean, that's...
Yes, it did.
Yeah.
And there were other pockets that would help augment that. But when you're talking about a casino of that size and that scope, where it really does put
And it was the
an
first
influx.
major building project
2.5
that we'd
Right.
seen in the
Right.
state.
What
right?
about the
It's a ton-
housing
it's-
recovery? Had you seen any positive impact from that?
Not necessarily, not right now, Tim.
But
A lot of our, if I may, just a lot of our market is driven, it is driven by the commercial
Right.
and the mid-sized work.
I want to add a comment about housing, though, which is something which the needle has been moving up in New Jersey prior to Sandy. The numbers through September, we had as many housing permits granted in the first 9 months of this year as we did in all of 2011. We're setting up, and actually the numbers were 37.5% higher than in the first 9 months of 2011. It's still a very low level. It's maybe half of what it was in 2005 or so, but it was clearly starting to move up in the right direction. That's just permits, obviously. After the permits, you have to get the labor working, but it was clear that that sector was starting to pull out. So that was a good sign,
Yeah.
what the storm means.
It's funny, talking about Hurricane Sandy, I feel like somewhat of a veteran of Hurricane Sandy in the sense that quite literally the eye of the storm probably came right over my house. Other than outside of Atlantic City, I could look out my backyard and really see the skyline of Atlantic City. So the eye of the storm came right over. And what was interesting about that is that people in the northern part of the state may not even be aware of how different the impact was in the northern barrier islands. When I say north, I should say central. Monmouth and Ocean County barrier islands, a very different story than what happened in the Atlantic County and Cape May County barrier islands. Atlantic City was virtually unscathed in terms of the tourism infrastructure. It was a tremendous disaster for the residential parts of Atlantic City. If you're familiar with Atlantic City, the homes that are along the bay, tremendous amount of water, tremendous amount of damage. The national media focused on the destruction of a piece of the boardwalk that was scheduled to be torn down up on the inlet facing Brigantine, if you're familiar with that area. If you look at the boardwalk along Atlantic City, virtually nothing happened. Virtually nothing happened in the Cape May County tourism.
Unfortunately, we went for the worst images we could find, right? I mean, that's what we do.
And there was very little that is damaged. In fact, Atlantic City is open for business. There is absolutely no issue.
But business in Atlantic City was not looking particularly good before Sandy. Is that
Well,
what's
as
happening with the
you
industry?
As you alluded to, since '06, when it peaked at about $5.2 billion worth of revenue, you're now at about probably $3 billion worth of revenue, which is still a big hunk of change.
And that drop is due to what? To increased
Well,
competition, to the economy, to all those factors?
If you look at the supply of the gaming product in the Mid-Atlantic region, as you know, Pennsylvania got into full-scale gaming. There are 4 casinos on the eastern part of the state. You've got Maryland in the act right now.
West
You've
Virginia.
got New York City substantially in the act. And I think you're going to see more urban centers as they search for revenue, more urban centers, whether it's Detroit or anywhere around the country, you'll see it's going to gravitate toward those cities because there's a hunt for revenue.
Yeah, I was curious because, I mean,
Yeah.
because it is obviously a nationwide trend, and from a totally non-emotional, detached viewpoint, part of me thinks that, man, it would have been nice if, not nice, it would have been interesting to see if you had a lot of structural damage in Atlantic City, what you could have done from a larger planning perspective to sort of reboot, right? Because so many of the properties are
Yeah,
tired.
let me take a
Yeah.
slightly longer perspective. And I was at a conference in Atlantic City where all the presidents of the head of the casinos were there. And their attitude, this was roughly 1999, their attitude was they didn't want to see any new competitors come into the city. They know their revenues were growing at 4 or 5% per year. Yeah, we have Foxwoods in Connecticut is giving us a little, but we're happy. We like our market share. We don't want to reinvest, and that was their attitude. And even though Las Vegas had developed almost 8 or 9 years earlier, starting with the Mirage, the super casinos,
Right.
And the like. So only when Borgata opened up did their eyes open up that we have to really change our business model if we're going to survive. So essentially, the decisions made 12, 13 years ago of standing pat when they could have cemented Atlantic City as almost indomitable. If you had 10 Revels, then you'd have a different place
Right.
today.
But will they double down, or not to make the
I
bad
think
pun,
long-
or will they pull out and
No, they're
fold?
not pulling out. What's going to happen is, you're seeing it now, about 28% of the city is now non-gaming revenue. As you know, in Las Vegas, it's probably 62% is retail, entertainment, and shopping. In Atlantic City, you're still a little bit under 30%. Over the next decade, I think you're going to see it flip. You're going to see the majority of revenue in Atlantic City, casinos, coming from non-gaming, that is entertainment, retail, dining, and I think what you're seeing is a transformation. Revel, I think, was the first post-casino centric project. It really is post-casino. Borgata is still a gaming centric property. It has great dining, great entertainment, but it was designed for the gamer. If you look at Revel, it was designed for leisure traveler, it was designed for group business, and gambling as well. But it really is the post-gaming centric product, and I think that's the trend going forward.
Are you also challenged by, or I had a discussion with someone who's helping out with the long-term planning of Atlantic City, and he said the demographics have completely changed where they were even 10 years ago. Are you finding that as well, that you're catering to a different audience?
Younger, yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
You don't see the buses going down the
The
parkway
bus is
anymore.
gone. There is
Yeah.
virtually everybody that comes into Atlantic City is coming in by car. In fact, it's very easy for me or anybody to know how many people are coming into town. All you have to do is look at the Expressway Toll Plaza count at the Pleasantville Toll Plaza coming into Atlantic City, if you're familiar with that area. Everybody drives in. There are no, the cliche of the blue-haired lady coming into Atlantic City. It's not happening.
Those days are gone.
Those days are gone.
If we look
Not
at
forever.
Atlantic City, perhaps Atlantic City then is starting to make a shift, has realized that, as Jim pointed out, they maybe made a mistake a few years ago. They've seen that. They're kind of moving forward. Can we look at Sandy, do we think, as an opportunity to say things have to change and maybe there's a silver lining in this? Let's look at the opportunity to rebuild infrastructure. Let's look at the opportunity to change some of the way we move forward. Do we think we're going to take advantage of those opportunities? Kevin?
You had raised the point about Atlantic City looking at its long term, and it will redefine itself. I think, and this is some of the discussions we're having internally and we're having with members of policy and decision makers, is this going to be the seminal moment by which we actually address our infrastructure needs? And it's interesting because when you deal or you have these conversations about really putting in effect substantial infrastructure needs for the long haul. We always see these reports that come out from the American Society of Engineers, Civil Engineers. They come out every couple of years, and
How many bridges are
yeah, and they come out with a grading system, and you see it every now and then in the news cycle. You had that unfortunate incident in Minnesota. I guess it was almost about 5 years ago, and everyone, for the next maybe 7 days, said, "Boy, we have to address this issue." And it's the next news cycle.
Yeah.
So
I think we're going to do is we've got some substantial foundation funding to run statewide survey, and it's going to be critical because we're going to need net new revenue to do that. Is there an appetite within the citizenry of the state to pay for the infrastructure improvements that are needed. Are they going to have, will they be willing to pay higher utility rates to build in resiliency into the utility system?
Huge question with utilities. What about some of the federal dollars that will be coming into the state? Can any of that be used to repair aging infrastructure?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just have to see how the federal funding is shaped. Yeah.
But in the long term, are the citizens, I always used to joke New Jerseyans want Cadillac-level services, and they're only willing to pay Chevrolet prices. But they don't even want to pay Chevrolet prices. They want the services for free. Same thing with our infrastructure. It takes money to do that. Are we willing to increase the gasoline tax in order to generate the money that's going to be needed?
It's it's exactly what the state really needs. When you look at the national level, there's two things I'd say. We look at what is the economic impact of a storm? Well, you have lost business, you have property damage, and all these things. But on the backside, you have the GDP pop from the rebuild, right? And we know that there is very little appetite for higher taxation, always, but even more so now.
Especially in New Jersey, which is one of the highest tax states in the country.
Yeah,
anyway.
I have to, yes.
And it's a huge opportunity in the places that were hit to really rebuild that infrastructure. The cynical side of me says that the appetite, the willingness to pay more to get it, it makes me cynical about the ability to actually realize that vision.
And I also think that our long-term planning about where we're going to live and how we're going to deal with the issues of these storms also plays into effect, because you had some of the bridges and the infrastructure into some of these coastal cities where single-lane roads, and are we going to look to go back to those areas that have to contend with these perpetuating storms that are taking place? And are we going to pay for the proper infrastructure to get in and out of there?
Well, one of the things, we had a very ambitious state development plan that was proposed by the governor. And if anybody read the paper, I think, November 12th or something, suddenly there's a meeting and everybody just kind of says, we'll talk about that later. So I think we have to ask what the impact of the storm will have now on all of that.
If you look at research on the impacts of storms, whether it's, I've looked at some work that was done since the 1940s. On the impact of hurricanes and natural disasters on areas. And what you do see is the pop in construction a year later, 6 months later. But I think over time what you see is that the impact of hurricanes are relatively minor. They don't really change the world. People will still go to the Jersey Shore. People love the beach. It'll get rebuilt. It won't have a long-term impact. But I think what leaders understand in this state is that for the future of New Jersey, you've got to invest in the workforce and you've got to invest in the infrastructure. If you go back to Economics 101 that we all took, the factors of production, you need labor and you need capital infrastructure. You need capital and it's infrastructure. So I think for the long term, the way to deal with unemployment is going to be education. And the way to deal with attracting business to the state, it's not going to be through higher taxes because we don't want it. But it's got to be through investment in the infrastructure that will attract business and then fix the job issue as well.
And that's long term, and we all know that
that's over time.
Voters don't think long term, and politicians don't think long term.
Because in a storm, this is really what I want to say. After every storm, there's always competing political pressure. People want the help now, and of course the politician wants to support the current needs. But very quickly, you have to move toward the long term solutions that the state really requires, and that's the interesting point. At what point do you stop fixing the current pain that people feel and start to rebuild for the future?
Just one point on that, and it's a bit of a stretch, but the same debate was had over the Recovery Act, that some critics said was way too much immediate investment in tapping people's veins right away. And there were fewer casts for broken bones if you want to, carry that through. And so I think a lot of people would have liked to have seen some more longer-term projects. I felt like Route 80 was repaved 3 times in 18 months, instead of maybe some major long-term things taken care of.
The sooner leaders can get to that, the better off we'll be.
But there's a feeling that they never will.
Well, there has been a ray of hope in that the ballot question that just passed in New Jersey speaks to that long-term investment, and it was the will of policy, certainly the governor, and just about everyone invested in that idea of long-term education funding. And it was a capital improvement, and we need to have that capacity to improve our higher education.
That passed by what, 62%? or something. It was
Yeah,
just
passed
pretty
overwhelmingly.
strong.
We're actually going to talk about that a bit in the education session, but we want to do some time for Q&A, but before we wrap up and move into that, let me just ask a quick question. I'm going to ask you all to sum up and give me, if you could, just 2 things that you think need to be done now to move the economy forward in New Jersey, understanding that the day after the presidential election, we now move into the legislative session and the election and the gubernatorial election for 2013. We're always in a campaign mode here in New Jersey. But if we could do 2 things in New Jersey, like now, what would be the best things to do? But Brian, let me ask you quickly, the fiscal cliff, right?
Hate the term. I don't like to use the word hate, but it's a term the general public cannot really even access. So.
It's you know, all these little lemmings going over the cliff, you know. Obviously, if there's some kind of an agreement reached in Washington, if dollars are saved somewhere, chances are they're going to come out of states and programs, things like that. Is that going to impact New Jersey's future if we, on the one hand, if we move towards some kind of successful negotiation in D.C., are we then looking at something that's going to give us fewer dollars here in New Jersey?
I don't see New Jersey as being disproportionately hurt by some sort of deal in D.C. And I think the hope is if you really do this cocktail mixture of cuts and revenue raising, and you ease it in the way the center would like to do it, the thought is that the economy and the markets are spring-loaded to grow. So if it's balanced the right way, you might see a really good stretch of growth if the right agreement is made, like one that is legitimately integrated, not just a kicking the can down the road. And I'm the least equipped to answer the question you want to finish it, so I'm just going to get myself out of the way, which is I think one of the major things that states need to do if they haven't is just take advantage of the low rates while they can to the extreme degree. I mean, some people think that the United States should do $1 trillion bond offer. While financing is not going to stay this way, and if people have the vision to take advantage of it, you can really lock in some great projects at some really, really cheap prices.
And Brian, quick up or down on the economy? Things looking up or things holding steady?
I honestly, and I'm not a cheerleader, so in some ways I'm not a Larry Kudlow, who's our right guy, and I'm not MSNBC on the left. I do, from what I see, if the deal's right, I think I don't want to say explode, but we could get a 4% economy. We really could. It's there. I just did a retail story in Wisconsin on Land's End and Cyber Monday, and people are spending money right now. Americans are. And so I think the economy has a little bit of a sleeping giant quality if the deal is done.
Great. Kevin, up or down? What do we need to do in New Jersey?
Feel better, confident. I agree with you on the fiscal cliff issue as well. 2 things. One is we have to, and this echoes what we said before, there is a skills gap. The need has changed. We've been lagging, and we need to bring ourselves up to that and invest accordingly. And number 2, at the end of the day, problems have to be addressed with leadership. Not the most popular decisions, but the ones that are going to make sure we have sustainable growth over the next decade or so.
Dr. Steindel.
Well, I think it's relatively straightforward. I think if we look back a generation, New Jersey's employment growth has lagged the nation, particularly in the private sector. I was a little appalled. In fact, somebody said, well, in the last expansion we did well because we expanded government so rapidly. I went, no, that's not exactly what we want to do. I think under the governor's leadership, New Jersey is beginning to become a better environment for business. I think we have to continue that. Everybody's talking about various things that government can do to make the state better, and I, generally agree with most of what's said. But I think the key element is the private sector getting a more dynamic environment for the private sector and the private economy to move the state forward. I think that's essential.
And you think we do that by lowering taxes? Is that
well? The question about lowering taxes, of course, we'd like a lower tax environment. On the other hand, the state has a lot of ongoing spending needs, which are very difficult to handle and arrange. We all know what they are. It's going to be it's a tough act, and we hope that we continue to do it. So far, we've done it in this administration. And we hope we can continue to do it, and I think that's. I'm not, not in a partisan position, and not really making a statement about the next election. But I hope we continue to do that. We have to, and I think in some ways the hurricane is a good opportunity. I agree. It's not necessarily a long-term factor in the state's growth, but handling the rebuilding and the reconstruction efficiently and
Should be.
do the job well, I think would be an excellent thing to show what the state can do.
Great. Jim, up or
Yep.
down, and what what should we do?
Generally up nationally for 2013, assuming the problems in Washington are resolved. However, the resolution of the tax and expenditure problems in Washington are going to have an impact on New Jersey. We rank dead last in the ratio of money sent to Washington and the money we get back. So for every dollar we send to Washington, we only get 50 cents back.
So anything that happens hurts us disproportionately.
Absolutely. And again, we rank, and it's because we have a progressive income tax on the national level. We rank second in median household income. Actually, we used to be #1, but Maryland had the audacity, the sheer audacity to knock us off of our top-ranked perch. But still, any higher rates on higher-incomed individuals is going to draw a lot of money out of New Jersey, send it to Washington, and the expenditure patterns means very little of it's coming back. So that could be a drag on the state economy. But the rebuilding that's going to have to take place, the immediate repairs and the like, depending on the level of federal aid coming in, is going to provide a pretty good boost to the economy.
And how long would that last? That boost should be 6, 8
could-
months?
It could be 3 or 4 quarters, but it's going to continue long term. I mean, you might get an immediate burst, but there's a lot of rebuilding that's not going to take place in a short period of time. There's a lot of approvals, there's a lot of planning that has to be done. And
So
the like.
a general long-term positive impact from this?
Depending if the resources we get are sufficient to cover it. To the degree New Jersey has to cover some of those expenditures itself, then we run into the fiscal problem within the state.
Dr. Posner, how much will Atlantic City contribute in tourism to our economy?
Well, you know, tourism is obviously the first victim of a coastal storm, which is what a hurricane is. By its nature, it's coastal. By its nature, the coastal areas obviously are tourism dependent. New Jersey has about a $40 million tourism economy. It's about the second or third largest piece of the $475 million, roughly, New Jersey economy. Billion, did I say million?
Billion, yeah.
So 38 billion is the tourism economy, and what Atlantic City represents is about, as I said earlier, about $3 billion in revenue, about 30,000 jobs, 45,000 if you take into account certain multipliers. You got $1.8 billion worth of expenditures on vendors around the state of New Jersey. So it's a really big deal, and as Atlantic City transforms into, in some sense, what it always was, which was a tourism mecca for the Northeast, and I think that's going to be a big driver. It'll continue to be a big driver.
So if Revel was a start in the right direction?
Revel is the first post-casino century. It's the first of the new paradigm that represents Atlantic City as a entertainment destination, not a gaming. Casino gaming is like movie theaters and bowling alleys. They're everywhere.
And Sandy doesn't really have an impact, then you think?
I don't think Sandy will have even a midterm impact on what Atlantic City is. It was on a path to becoming an entertainment destination. I think that path will continue. I don't think Sandy will have much of an impact on what Atlantic City is. It has a major impact on the feeder market into Atlantic City in the near term.
Good point. So, terrific. Do we have any questions for the panel? Liz Landau will come around with a. We have a mic? No, we don't have a mic, but we do have a question back there. So, yeah.
I'll just talk loud.
Yes.
I recently authored a report on financial hardship in New Jersey that showed about a third of households in New Jersey are struggling to afford the high cost of living here. And so I'd like to ask the panel, what opportunities and obstacles do you think the hurricane recovery and the gubernatorial election present for these households, either in terms of increasing their wages or making more affordable housing, transportation, childcare, health care? I think it's a big problem in our state that a third of households are struggling, and it's going to be a drag on the economy unless we can make an impact there.
Any impact on most New Jerseyans?
I'll do an initial stab. Those are very real, very real, serious concerns. But for the broader state picture, they may well be backburnered in the immediate term because all the focus is going to be on the areas that got specifically hit by the hurricane. So How that plays out, I don't think anybody knows right now, but the focus really isn't on those structural problems in the economy. It's how do we help those areas that got hit and people that got hit the hardest by the storm.
So in that sense, it's a negative impact in that it takes away the
at least
focus.
in the short term.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think affordability, you know, for the families that you're, the 1/3 that you're describing, I continue to try to think long term. Even though I'm an old guy, I try to think long term. That the solutions are going to be through education and attracting jobs to attracting industry to New Jersey.
Yes.
As jobs and industry are attracted to the state, the opportunities for individuals to uplift themselves and their families will be there. I don't think there are any short-term solutions that are sustainable. If there were, we'd have done them.
Okay. Do we have another question? Yes.
Good afternoon. I'm Betty Spinelli from Hudson County. And yes, we have a very high unemployment rate. And in keeping with this discussion, I'm noticing in my county a lot of people from the Middle East coming in with their entire families, renting apartments that are in fact kind of like boarding houses, and they're being put into very good jobs. In my discussion with people that are holding these positions and living among us, I'm hearing that they're not being paid as much as a regular worker would be paid, that they don't necessarily get benefits, and they also are not getting health care. Is there any truth to this? Because it has me greatly concerned, since I'm seeing a dramatic shift in a county that has traditionally been a place where most people come to our country for the first time. I'm not seeing these people coming to our country as people willing to stay, as some people have put it to me, no, we're here to do this job, and then when this job is over, we're going home. I've seen that also down the Jersey Shore in Cape May with the summer help, which were being brought in from Middle Eastern places and Europe on a transitional basis, and then just sent home. Now, you know, the Jersey Shore, I guess, is one thing, but now we're talking about big companies and the skill sets. I mean, we could send our kids to college forever, but if a company is not going to hire them because they'd have to pay them benefits, it would be an entirely different subject.
I guess, Dr. Hughes, how are we dealing with the that portion of the labor market would be the question.
I think for the most part it's been ignored. It's a very real problem, and there's no real easy solution to it. And again, it's almost circular. New Jersey is an extraordinarily expensive place to live, high cost of living. That's a deterrent to job growth. And so it's almost a negative feedback loop there that's creating this problem.
I was just looking at some statistics, by the way, that I think you're right about your observation. I think Hudson County leads the state in the number of residents who are foreign born. I think it's almost, I don't think it's quite 50%, but it's probably in the mid-40s. Wow. More than any other county in the state. It's probably 40% foreign born.
And I think the skills gap and the gulf between worker capabilities and the job market is really illustrated in Hudson, because the Hudson River waterfront, the office complex there, has the lowest office vacancy rate in the state. So essentially your office economy is doing extraordinarily well, but you have a big segment of the population that is not.
I would just say it's a national problem, and it brings up two huge macro issues up, which is immigration and healthcare. And so that's something felt everywhere else. But it's funny, I was going to almost say something in the inverse of what you just said, because there's a lot of jobs that unemployed Americans still won't do. And that's been part of the disconnect too. So there needs to be, I don't know what your area is like, so I can't speak to it, but I do know that, you know, somebody who's laid off doing X won't deign to do Y if it means going back to work. And so there's the void of some of these lower skill jobs too, where there are these gaps too. So we've talked about the higher skill jobs that people aren't trained for and we need education for, but then there's a slew of jobs that a lot of Americans don't want to do.
Are those good paying jobs, well paying jobs?
They're not.
Well, they're not. Well, so I guess the question would be, I guess if you have nothing versus, working for minimum wage or even less, I guess in some cases.
Compared to what? $10 an hour may be very little, or $9 an hour, or $8 an hour, but compared to 50 cents an hour, it's pretty good.
Right, and the analogy I use so much during the financial crisis is, and with this debt deal you want to do, is it, would you rather take a 10% pay cut or lose your job?
It's a tough question for people who are surviving.
I mean, I think it's an easy answer. I'd take a 10% pay cut rather than lose my job. And that's sort of what Americans need to get their arms around to really make progress.
Any other questions? Yes, 1, 2 quick questions, and then we'll wrap this up. Yes.
Hi, my name is Tribuna, and I'm a Rutgers MBA student. And I have a question. A lot of the talks about redevelopment for the state of New Jersey is looking to attract new businesses, companies, and such. And when you look at the revenue stream for the state and the corporate business tax proportion to it, I guess my question is to what extent are we willing to trade off this attraction of new businesses while providing these subsidies at such low amount? When also you look at the income tax proportion, it comes primarily from the high income earners in the state, and we have a growing base of low income earners who don't contribute a lot. So, what extent are we willing to continuously attract businesses with low subsidies and yet keep allowing their revenue contribution, their contribution to our revenue to be that low? And the second question is, on the sales tax point, you talked about this penetration of internet sales. What is has the state considered, or are they in the process of discussing how we can get revenue from these big online discount stores such as Google? I know other states have tried it. I mean, are we looking at that?
I'll let you take that one first.
That's a very interesting set of questions, and thank you. On the corporate tax, you're right. The corporate tax has been diminishing over the years as a contributor to state income tax revenue. We're not alone in this. Virtually every state and the federal government experiences that. Corporations are extremely good at figuring out ways to avoid paying the corporate income tax. We're well aware of that. The business coming into the state, you're quite right, the state income tax, because of its high progressivity, is top heavy, where about, the rule of thumb, it varies year to year, is about 40% of the tax is paid by the top 1% of earners in the state. So it is quite top heavy. I think by some metrics, we have the most progressive income tax in the nation. Not the highest rate at the top, a few other states are higher, but ours, we start low. Other states which are high actually start pretty high. We start low, we move up. I do think, however, a corporation, a good business which moves into the state, the workers from top to bottom are going to be paying income tax. The income is going to be taxed. And we have to remember, of course, the workers at the company are going to be buying things in the state and paying sales tax, which segues into the internet question. Estimates you usually hear, and this gets into the question of the growth of the sales tax, is New Jersey loses, several $100 million a year in sales tax from people making sales tax eligible purchases over the internet, getting them shipped into the state, and not paying their required use tax. Many people aren't even aware, in fact, that actually you're supposed to pay sales tax on anything you buy in the state. The big thing, of course, that people will buy out of state is a car. That, when they register the car, they have to pay the sales tax. But that's, in looking at that, of course, Amazon is now building a distribution center in Robbinsville, and as part of the whole arrangement, since Amazon will now have a presence in the state, Amazon, as of July 1st, will start to collect sales tax, New Jersey sales tax on purchases made by New Jersey residents, so that Amazon is the single biggest internet purveyor. So that, we expect to get some money from that, $40–50 million of that, which is not.
So we're moving in the direction of it.
We're moving in the direction of that. I think the general belief is that gradually the internet sales will get swept under the state sales tax. There's an awful lot of consumer resistance to that, as you're well aware. But the other thing about the internet penetration in New Jersey sales, it's growing rapidly, but it's still a relatively small portion of overall sales. And you have to realize, of course, the feature of New Jersey sales tax that we always like to advertise is we don't have a sales tax on clothing. that's an awful large fraction of internet purchases. So that wouldn't be
matter anyway. So
that wouldn't be it. It's electronics. I think.
Quick, yeah. And then one last quick question.
You know, on the issue of subsidies or providing for corporations to come to a town, I worked in Woodbridge for 10 years, and there were numerous occasions where we worked with a company to provide attractions, and the state does this all the time, whether it be an abatement or a pilot. You know, and it's mindful, and you have to recognize this is, it's about providing an attractive assistance or attracting a business to your township. Mayors, as we were just talking about, people are starving for revenue, so you want to bring in that rateable and you want to bring in those jobs. It's a question of whether you're providing a responsible assistance and not a giveaway, because that has always been an issue of contention for the years that I worked here, and that is if you're going to provide an abatement for a corporation or an entity to come to your town, you don't do it often. It's one that would provide X amount of jobs and hopefully be a corporate citizen, is you want to make sure that at the end of the day they're paying what they're supposed to, but it's when they pay, how they pay, there's a whole formula driven to that. So it really comes down to making sure that the entity that's doing that is responsible and don't let the corporation off the hook.
Steve, quick question, wrap up.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Steve Diltz with CH2M Hill. I was curious what you see the role of climate change playing with the economy. In other words, not only post-Sandy, but the threat of the next Sandy, and if that's the new normal, how we mitigate and adapt, and how does that shape both our planning and economic efforts moving forward.
Brian, why don't you take that one?
I think it's
Give you the
all,
easy ones.
I mean, everything goes back to politics. Depends on if you believe it or not, right? I mean, and you know, in my world, which is a lot of there are more conservative voices on my network than liberal. They tend to think it's more myth than reality. So I don't know. I mean, I'd like to make a funny joke. You should just move to higher ground. But I don't know what the impact is. I think we have to find out over the course of a generation if we do have more storms like this, then we know something. From the economic perspective, there's no wide acceptance that it's a reality. So I almost am not even qualified to touch it.
Let me make just a personal observation from my own neighborhood in Hunterdon County, and I think the citizens are far ahead of the political system in adapting to changing weather patterns and the like. When I installed a whole house generator last fall or last spring because of my experience, because we have an area that never is ranked dead last in coming back online. And I'd go out and shut the generator off at night, and I'd go outside, and all I could hear was the noise of generators in my neighborhood. There's virtually nobody that does not have a generator today. So people themselves are adapting to climate change right now. So I think they're going to be amenable to any public actions that are rational.
Great. Thank you all so much. You've been terrific. I wish we could keep all these panels going like all afternoon, but thank you all so much for being here.